Have you ever wondered why steak from the supermarket just doesn't taste as good as the steak from a local butcher or direct from a farmer? Could it be more than just the cut? Hi, I'm Craig, and I think the answer is yes. In order to understand why, we have to dive into the story behind your meat. Now, it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that there might be a difference in quality, taste, texture, experience of eating meat from the supermarket versus meat directly from a farm or from a local butcher. We have a similar experience when we eat an apple right off of a tree at a U-pick orchard versus the apple that's been sitting on the shelf of the supermarket for the last several months. Or the experience of eating fresh-made guacamole made fresh tableside at a nice restaurant compared to the green stuff that looks like guacamole in a sealed packet that was made months ago and has been sitting in refrigeration in a grocery store. This is not all that unique, but it's also true for meat. And many of us fail to remember that what we experience with other food products happens also with meat. What I want to do in this video is take you through the background of how meat ends up on the supermarket shelf on the one hand versus how meat ends up in your hands through a local butcher or directly from a local farm. So I want to go to the table and let's write this out. Okay, so in terms of how you might source your meat, there are basically two paths. One we might call the typical process. If you're buying meat from the grocery store, this is the process by which a steak or a roast or ground beef ends up on the supermarket shelf and into your hands. At the beginning of the stage, we find ourselves on a cattle ranch. This is where calves are born. These farmers raise mama cows that have babies that are destined to be beef. Once those calves are weaned, they're brought to a livestock auction. At that auction, the buyer is the third person in the process, and these are called stocker operations. The stocker is the person who takes a weaned calf and then grows that animal to a weight ready for it to go to a finishing operation, which before they get to the confined animal feeding operation or CAFO, they make another stop at the auction house. Now, confined animal feeding operations are where animals go to be fattened. Typically, this is where the term feedlot comes from. Animals will be in confined spaces, so they can't move around very much and burn calories. Instead, they're forced to simply eat and stand or lie around so that they put on weight quickly and can be brought to market as quickly as possible. After they finish fattening, they arrive at a slaughterhouse. After a slaughterhouse, number 7, these animals go to a processor. This separation between a slaughterhouse and a processor actually allows for a little loophole in labeling, which leads to some misleading labeling practices where an animal might be born, raised, finished, and slaughtered outside of the United States. But if that carcass then comes to a processor in the United States, that meat can now be labeled as product of the USA. To me, that's a little bit misleading. Now, number 8 is the grocery store. And then finally, number 9 would be you. So you're the 9th person in a supply chain in this typical process. Now, an alternative to the typical process is the direct-to-you process. This is what you encounter if you are buying directly from a local butcher who's actually sourcing the beef locally from neighboring farms, or if you're buying directly from a farmer. The process looks something like this. The first step is the farmer. Sometimes, in our case at Melvin Home Meats, this is us. We do have farm partners that help to raise some of the animals that we sell, and then many of them are grown right here on our farm. Number 2 is the slaughter/processing facility. This is typically on a small scale, all one place. It is the case for us. It's all one place, and that's the last stop before you. So if you're buying from a local butcher, there may be a 2B step here where the butcher sources that meat from the slaughter or processing facility. In our case, we are the farm, the slaughter, processing facility, the butcher, and then we deliver directly to you. Okay, so why does this matter? It matters because the typical process is designed for scale and efficiency and quantity of production. So this is the environment in which we have, for example, the confined animal feeding operations, where what do? They're aimed at producing fat animals as quickly as possible. Most of these animals coming from that environment wouldn't live much longer past their slaughter date anyway, because they're in poor health. They're obese. That's how they get so fat. They're actually at the point of obesity. There are many cases of hearts of these beef animals actually growing so large and exploding inside of them because they're under such stress. So we are actually, by that model, feeding our entire population unhealthy animals instead of harvesting animals at the height of their health so that we maximize our nutrition when we eat that beef. This is also the environment that leads to practices such as gas treatments inside of sealed meat containers so that the meat retains a red color even long after it would be desirable to eat. So when you see pre-sealed containers in the grocery store, that has a special gas treatment so that the meat looks very attractive to you, even though the meat might not otherwise look very attractive to you if it hadn't been subject to that special treatment. Now, lastly, why you should care about this difference and maybe reconsider participating in the typical process for sourcing your meat is that it's a very fragile system. As we experienced during the coronavirus pandemic, having concentrated meat production in the hands of 4 large corporations across just a handful of very large processing facilities could lead to massive disruption in our supply chain with just a small amount of interruption. Now compare that to the direct-to-you model, which is not admittedly designed for efficiency and quantity at scale. This model, to actually feed our nation, would require more people to participate in the production of the animals and the processing of those animals. So many more small farmers, many more small processors would need to come on the scene to make this a viable option to feed the whole population. But that doesn't mean that we can't participate in it to some extent already today. See, that model of having animals living on a farm nearby or on the same land where they will be slaughtered and butchered allows for the animals to express their natural tendencies, for cows to actually live on pasture their whole life, to grow more slowly in a healthy way, so that when the animal is actually harvested, it's at peak nutrition, peak health, so that it can provide peak nutrition to those of us who eat the beef. One of the things that I think has been most striking to me as I started this business, Melvin Hill Meats, and started providing the service of slaughtering and butchering people's animals and then raising my own animals to sell to others and process for them, is that all of the rules that are out there from the USDA are really designed for very large processing plants where the slaughterman and butcher don't have relationship with the end consumer. See, in my case, when I have to shake somebody's hand who's going to eat the beef that I raised and butchered and packed for them, now I feel a responsibility that I wouldn't feel if I was just in a large processing facility on a line of 100 butchers processing hundreds of cows a day. Instead, in my case, I have to look that person in the eye. I have to show respect for them. I have to show care for them as an actual individual person whom I know. And so now quality control in our facility is far beyond anything that you would expect to see in a facility where customers are simply nameless, faceless, millions of people who are going to eat the beef that's flying through assembly lines in a mass production facility. And I think that it's tempting to discount the relationship factor, but I think the relationship factor is actually the primary thing that can lead to higher quality, higher nutritional products. And it's also going to be what actually preserves and regenerates the farmland in our country. There are obviously pros and cons to both ways of acquiring your meat, whether from the local supermarket or directly from a local butcher or local farm. So let's talk about some of those things so that you feel confident in your assessment of both options. The one big pro in the column under supermarkets that stands out is convenience. For you to be able to drive down the street to any one of, let's say, 4 supermarket chains you might have near you and find a wide variety of meats, which we might call the second pro in supermarkets, that you have the convenience factor. They're always available, many of them open 24 hours a day, as well as the wide variety that you'll always find stocked on shelves. And this would include both non-prepared products like raw steaks and roasts, as well as prepared products. There's something to be said for the convenience and variety factor that you get at a local supermarket. So there are 2 main cons in the case of buying meat from the supermarket. The first one is limited knowledge of where that meat came from, how it was raised, how it was processed. These things we can't know when we buy meat on the shelf at a supermarket. If you ask the meat cutter behind the counter, they'll tell you it came out of a box. Now, what about the pros in the case of buying directly from a farm? Well, I think 2 should be mentioned. 1, the quality that you can be confident in because you know where that meat came from. So instead of having limited knowledge about it, you have the maximum knowledge about where it came from and what quality that meat carries with it. The second is customization. So when you buy from a local farm, let's say you buy a share of beef or a share of pork, you're going to have the opportunity to actually customize how the butcher processes that for you. And if you're buying from a local butcher who practices whole animal butchery, you're going to have an incredible amount of customization so that you can get that steak cut just the way you want it, or have the roast cut and tied in a way that suits your party plans just right. So those 2 factors of quality and customization are 2 that I think are really important to mention. And what about on the cons side for buying directly from a farmer or butcher? I think the main one would be the lack of that immediate convenience that you might have in the case of the supermarket, having a wide variety always available. So that the con for buying directly from a local farm or butcher might be that what you need is not always readily available, and you may have to plan in advance to give notice to that farmer or butcher that you are looking for a particular cut, or you want to have a certain roast or steak for an event. You can't wait till the day before maybe, because that farmer or butcher is not always stocking the wide variety ready to go at a moment's notice. Now, I mentioned earlier the point about the importance and value of having a relationship with, from my perspective, the person that I'm providing meat to. I think also as a consumer, if I'm going to eat meat, then I have a responsibility to know where it comes from and have a relationship with it in some way. I have a story to share from a recent catering event where we provided pulled pork for an event, and the pork was in the form of a half of a hog. So a half of a hog on a smoker and laid it out in a beautiful presentation at this man's retirement party. And there was a particular woman who came up in line, and she held her plate out wanting pork, but she looked up the whole time and she said these words that I want something, I want a piece of meat, but I don't want to watch, because I want it to be like the grocery store where I don't have to admit that it came from an animal. Okay, so she wants to eat meat, but she wants none of the responsibility that comes with eating meat. What I would say, and from my own experience have realized this more and more, that if I'm going to eat meat, which requires the death of another animal, I have a responsibility of knowing where that animal came from and how it was raised, and that it was raised in accord with its nature, not just for my own health, but out of a responsibility for the care of that animal. And I can only have that when I have a relationship in some way with the farmer. Whether I actually visit the farm or not, at least I can know the person and talk to them about how they raised the animal so that I can fulfill my responsibility of making sure that if I'm going to eat the flesh of that animal that had to be killed to feed me, I'm taking responsibility in its care. Okay, so to recap, key points that I want you to take away from this video. Number one, buying meat directly from a farm or a local butcher ensures that you're going to get higher quality meat that's tastier and more transparent in terms of its origin, where it came from, how it was raised. Number two, if you're buying from a local butcher, make sure that butcher is developing relationships with local farms so that there's a clear line of sight in the supply chain. If that butcher's simply buying boxed meat from one of the big meat suppliers in our country, then you're not really getting anything different than you are at the supermarket, except maybe some additional customization. And then lastly, shop based on value. So think about the whole package. What are you getting in terms of not just dollars for pounds, but what's in that pound of meat? Where did it come from? What's the story behind it? How is it going to nourish you and your family? How did the practices that brought that animal to you as meat, how did those practices either deplete or regenerate the farm that it was raised on? So consider the whole picture when you consider the value of what you're buying, whether from the supermarket or directly from a farm or local butcher. So with those things in mind, I encourage you, next time you're considering a meat purchase, look into the options you have to buy directly from a farm or from a local butcher so you can actually experience the quality difference that I started with in this video, that it might be more than just the cut. If you're ready to get meat for yourself that satisfies your taste buds and nourishes your body, check us out at Melvin Hill Meats. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get more insights on food quality and ethical sourcing.